Welcome to the Wisdom and Trust Messengers Race and Medicine Series Part 2, entitled Generational Trauma, First Nations. My name is Gail Katz, and I'm one of the co-founders of WISDOM. So WISDOM stands for Women's Interfaith Solutions for Dialogue and Outreach in Metro Detroit. And we've been a nonprofit organization since 2007. So the mission of WISDOM is to provide concrete modeling of women from different faith traditions, working together in harmony for the common good, to empower women to take a more active role in furthering social justice and world peace, to dispel myths, stereotypes, prejudices, and fear about faith traditions different from our own, and to nurture the growth of empathy and spiritual energy that results from our projects and interfaith dialogue. So WISDOM refuses to accept the worldview of fear that causes domination and control over others who are different from ourselves. We instead underscore the worldview of a caring and loving relationship with others and recognize that our own well-being depends on the well-being of everyone else in our community. WISDOM recognizes that Metro Detroit is made up of diverse and very segregated communities. And our mission is to turn that diversity into pluralism, where we learn, encounter, dialogue, respect, and champion the other. So let's get started on understanding another community this evening, that of the Native Americans. And I would now like to turn our program over to Dolores Lyons.
Dr. Fuller, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this program. Part of the reason we are doing this race in medicine has to do a lot with COVID vaccine hesitancy. And, you know, you will cover this with the Sioux Nation as well.
Thank you, Dolores, and welcome to everyone for the second in the Race and Medicine series that was envisioned by WISDOM and is in conjunction in partnership with TrustMessengers, which is a team that I lead that actually engages with taking science discoveries into communities to help reach science into all parts of the world. And so we're very excited because we know that the COVID pandemic, which looks like is getting to that light at the end of the tunnel, has affected all people all the way around the world, but it has certainly had high effects on certain groups as many other diseases and has unveiled some of the inequities that have allowed loss of life and loss of lots of things. So we're trying to do the backstories that help us to get to the third part of the series, which is going to be focused on COVID. And we thought it not robbery in the series, which first focused on African Americans with Dr. Jesselyn Anderson giving us some of the key backdrop that many of us were not aware of, to look at other groups, which includes Latinx and Asians, as well as our First Nations, as we've learned to call them. And because of the lack of information or lack of visibility, we decided to focus on First Nation. We are very, very grateful tonight to WISDOM for hosting and thankful that Judy Nimer Muhn is here, one in Detroit, of Polish and German ancestry on her father's side and Scottish, French, and Native from her mother's side. Her French-Canadian ancestors, some of the earliest settlers in Acadia and Quebec, intermarried with First Nation people of the Mi'kmaq and Abenaki nations, who are also now adopted either to or by or adopted the Lakota or Sioux natives. And she's going to tell us about how to say all that, because I'm sure I'm not quite putting it in the right context. She's currently living in Milford with her husband of many years, and she works in Ann Arbor as a organizational development specialist for nonprofit enterprises that do so many things with strategic planning, executive coaching, race equity, justice work. As a researcher and speaker and blogger and workshop leader, she focuses on tracking French-Canadian, Acadian, First Nations, and Scottish ancestry. And she offers these services to others. So she has a company called Lineage Journeys, and I would encourage you to check that out on the website. In her professional career, she's been many things: an administrator and executive director for many nonprofit organizations, including the American Red Cross, the Girl Scouting in the US and Germany, the United Way, and others. She has a degree in medical technology, so she's very relevant to this discussion on medicine and race, or race and medicine, and 2 master's degrees in human resource management and counseling psychology. So in short, Judy brings tonight heritage, education, sensitivities, and broad experiences that make her uniquely well-suited to share in this journey on race and medicine. So I'm so grateful to welcome you and to be able to share this time with you as we learn a little bit more about the backstory of our sisters and brothers who were in this country before any of us were here. So Judy, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Oveta. I'm going to share my screen so that I can share a little teeny slideshow that I want to go through kind of quickly because it'll foster some of our conversation. So I'm hoping that that'll be helpful to everyone. So in honor of my family and my lineage, the Woptaga Chips line, this is a photograph of my brother, or my Tiblo, and my Unchi, or grandmother. So in honor of the people named on the slide, and in honor of all the people here in Michigan of the Three Fires Confederation, and those who were here even before that, the Miami, Sauk and Fox, Kickapoo, and many more, on whose land we are sitting that was stolen from them. I'm hoping that I'll give you a perspective on some of the long-term issues that we've all addressed in the Native community, and give you some understanding about not only our cultural values and some of the things that have happened for us historically, and why I refer to us as a culture of invisibility. We'll talk about some of the generational damage, and there are certainly ways that you can engage and support our cultures and some of the issues. So we'll get into that when Oveta and I get into conversation.
Judy, before you get into the stats, can you go back to the picture of your brother and grandmother?
Sure.
I'm just seeing such a resemblance there. Now, is your brother very tall and your grandmother was very short, or?
Yes, yes. So, yes, so Charles was 6'5", and when she was maybe 4.5 feet.
Wow, that.
As you know, when you get elderly, you kind of shrink a little bit spinal column wise, but yeah.
That is such a striking picture. I'm glad you told us who they were, because I was wondering when I saw this, like, now, they gotta be related, but how are they related to you? All right, yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure. I'm glad you asked. So anyway, a whole bunch of statistics, and I'm not gonna go through it. You know, you certainly can read just as easily as anybody, but overall, there are 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States, each one uniquely different. And even from 1 mile to the next, there are differences in families, there are differences across what are called reservations, rancherias, or reserves. So very many differences. So I won't go into all of this detail, but I wanted to share a little bit with you. Some people get very confused about the fact that I refer to myself as Lakota. Most people know the word Sioux. And so that's a word that derives from another language, not our own. And we call ourselves Lakota, which means friend or ally. And most Native tribal peoples have names for themselves from their own language that usually refers to friend, ally, the people, the original ones, the elders, you know, that sort of thing. So most of the words that are seen by the dominant culture are words about tribes that are derived from other sources, not those of our own language.
So could I just ask, can you go back just a second? Again, I want to learn. So yeah, when I ask you of your ancestry, is is it Lakota? Is it Sioux? What's the right way to say that? What's the right one?
So Lakota is the nation, and I'm also a descendant of the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki.
So they are subgroups of the Lakota Nation? No,
they're Eastern tribes. They're part of that 574 federally recognized groups. So lots of Native people intermarry with other Native people. So, to be 100% Lakota is one thing, but you might be Lakota because you're from this particular part even of what could be broadly called the Great Sioux Nation. But there are 7 subdivisions in the Lakota Nation. And so we marry across borders and across, reservation lines and across other tribal groups. So that's part of the benefit of some of our social gatherings is we get to meet our future husband or wife.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to chew on this a little bit. Thank you.
That's okay. That's all right. So this is a picture of 4 generations ago, my ancestor Woptaka and his wife around her. So her name is very much longer, and I won't even say it because you won't retain it anyway. But nonetheless, there are lots of myths, and I really would like Oveta and I to have a chance to talk about some of the myths. Maybe what I'll do is get through the slides and we can come back to this one if necessary. But there's a lot of things that I'd like to talk about relative to myths and things not to say and do and all of that. So we'll come back to that, okay? From a historical perspective, in pre-1491, so 1492 being the year that we sort of recognize that some level of the higher invasion happened, there were estimated of over 18 million people on this, what we call Turtle Island. By 1650, it was down to 6 million, and by 1900, less than 300,000. This was due to diseases, warfare, and the removal of access to our native foods, which decimated many of our tribes. The diseases notably were smallpox, measles, influenza, cholera, and more. And it's believed by estimations to have killed 90% of the indigenous peoples in North America. We also were victimized in slavery, both between and among tribes and also by the Europeans that invaded. And then obviously there were many massacres and forced marches. I'll talk about that in a minute. Malnutrition, starvation, exposure, and stress clearly affected our health, and especially in the reservation period and beyond, which began in the 1880s and continues to this day, with higher levels of diabetes, hypertension, self-medication, forced sterilizations, and more. The forced marches that some people might know about were initiated by Presidents James Monroe and Andrew Jackson. And the idea being that the European peoples on the east coast of the United States were gradually getting bigger and bigger and bigger and moving out and out and out, and encountered native peoples who justifiably were trying to protect not only their own hunting territory and their farming lands, but the conflicts obviously built to a critical level. And these presidents decided that it was better to remove and or kill the native peoples. So I've just listed a few of the many massacres and forced marches that were forced upon our people. You're seeing in this picture a picture of the cemetery, the mass grave of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which was one of the massacre sites of our people in 1890. The other realities of our life was the massive slaughter of bison on the northern plains, which is my own tribe's, a very decimating effect on my own tribe. This is a photograph of buffalo skulls that were piled up after this massacre They were shot by Europeans traveling across the United States on trains. They were just shot from the windows and then left to rot. So the meat source was virtually eliminated. Our spiritual traditions were made illegal, and our elders were labeled insane and locked away in a variety of hospitals and military facilities. There was little, if any, medical care or support, and commodities, which was huge chunks of really awful cheese and big bags of flour and more, began the terrible turn of all of our bodies toward diabetes, with the lack of the natural exercises that we did from hunting and gathering and moving around the territories. Reservations forced us into government housing, which was crowded, unsafe, and has black mold, no access to running water and toilets for a significantly long period of time. And even now, government housing has problems with maintenance of all of these access points, the water and the toilets, etc. The children were forced into government and church-run schools to assimilate them, cutting their hair, punishing them for speaking their language. There were massive amounts of sexual abuse and physical abuse that happened.
Judy, before you go on, could you just go back? This mass slaughter, I mean, there's so much on this slide, but let me just start with the picture. The mass slaughter of bison.
Yes.
When did this happen, and what was the supposedly reason for this?
Well, so because the Native people had been in the late 1800s forced onto reservations, they weren't allowed to hunt in the natural way. And part of the way of, shall we say, putting down the Native population's attempts at, fighting back and trying to retain their lands, the government decided that they would, in effect, slaughter the food source of the people. So the bison, being a key food source of the Northern Plains, killed off as many bison as they could. And again, to the point of the railroads were part of that. Settlers just brought their guns on the train and just fired from outside from the windows. And then the bison were left to rot on the prairie.
So this food
so this
source
picture is from this. These are all skulls.
So this food source, so important to the Native people's livelihood, not only for food, but for the buffalo hide and so many other ways, was systematically and purposefully slaughtered just to get rid of them as a way of limiting the life and the livelihood and the way that the Native people lived. It was purposefully done to it's a wow. Okay.
Yeah. And more. So yeah, that's just a rather remarkable picture. So that's why I wanted to use it. So all of the treaties that were signed between the various Native peoples and the U.S. government have been violated. So well over 360 treaties have, were written, and Native peoples fully didn't understand what was going on when that happened. The idea of land ownership is not something that's an indigenous value. We were caretakers. We were just one of the many creatures that utilize the land for our food sources and living on, but we didn't see land ownership in the way the Europeans did. So many of these treaties were to grab land and then violate the treaty on the promises of the either reimbursement in monetary or goods or in some other lands that were given in place of, but they were all violated anyway, so it doesn't matter. The other big issue for us in modern times is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this is a function of the different law enforcement agencies between reservation law enforcement and that of the surrounding communities. There are well over and counting 5,000 plus missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And those are the ones that we know about. So we know that there are more. We know that there are families that are reaching out and continually sharing information about, you know, someone in their family that went off to a job and never came home, or they went off to school and never came back. Some bodies have been found, but the awful problem there is that if a person off reservation harms a woman on reservation, they aren't subject to reservation law. And if the reservation resident goes off reservation and gets killed, then they aren't covered by the other laws off reservation. So, and there is no tracking mechanism that any of the policing forces use to keep track of women that go missing. So the ongoing struggle is that law enforcement doesn't even know how many of our people are missing and murdered, but our families are coming forward and indicating who they know about, what they know about them, and where they may be left, you know, were missing from. There are ongoing searches by whole families to find the women. There's so much more information I could talk about that. The effects of all of this is ongoing generational trauma, unstable families because of the emotional, psychological issues. Certainly we can all identify that, you know, acting out on a variety of ways through either the use of substances to numb some of the pain, both psychological and physical. There are very poor health outcomes because of the poor diet and the lack of our usual exercise patterns and the poverty of all of our people. Most reservations are not places where jobs can be obtained, so Native peoples have to travel many, many miles, often for hours, to even get to somewhere where they can have a job. There's very poor educational access to transportation. If you're very, very poor, there are buses out to the reservation, so you have to have your own car, and that's obviously expensive. Mental illness because of all the trauma, the handed down stories, and what we know about our own situation is just very dire, to the extent that the suicide rate for our youth is 7 times higher than any other population in the United States. The poor behaviors of our families because of their adaptive coping with the stress that they're dealing with, poor relationship skills and role models. Yes, some of this is improving, but these are, you know, all of the stacked effects that are creating trouble. The health impacts are traumatic for the recent pandemic. Tribes have not received the level of immunization care, immunization vaccines that they need. Many of the tribes are in very isolated communities. Some of them have even been featured on television interviews and programs about their lack of even running water to even just keep their hands clean. The health disparity within tribal cultures is notable. The Indian Health Service is has been very, very bad in taking care of our peoples. There are some exceptions, but the exceptions are few and far between. The government has done multiple ways of damaging our tribal people through funding, neglect, government regulation, and red tape that just boggles the mind. We are optimistic, however, that the new Secretary of the Interior is a Native woman, a woman that was originally a congressional representative from New Mexico, but then elevated now to be the first Native to serve as a cabinet secretary and the first woman and first Native to be in this role. So we're really excited about that because she's a remarkable woman and there's lots we can do to support her. So with that, I'd love to just continue and have a conversation.
Wow. So thank you, first of all, for being here and for sharing what you bring. There's so many things I want to follow up on. So first of all, realizing that we are hopefully coming to an end in the US, or a new normal in the US, of the COVID pandemic, and realizing that Natives are some 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 as are African Americans and other ethnic groups. This all leads to why that stat comes up and why it should not be surprising at all. So the first question I have for you is about the invisibility. I mean, I'm hearing this, and I know some of it from things like the Trail of Tears, and some about how tuberculosis has affected Natives, how diabetes and the effect of alcohol and even other mental illness is high. But when I look at the legacy of what has occurred, I'm just amazed that Native First Nations survive in this country. So first of all, I think we just need to salute survival and resilience. Why do you think this is so invisible?
Well, so number one, we aren't the largest of population groups in the United States. So that's, certainly from a numbers standpoint, we aren't so huge, right? The other thing is take a look at me. A lot of people think about Native people in a stereotypical way. Long black hair, darker skin than mine, clearly, and yes, I do have European blood. And, you saw the picture of my brother and my grandmother. So certainly, they represented the more stereotypical view. But Native people have red hair, they have curly hair. There's lots of variations. So a lot of people don't even recognize that some of us are Native, right? And then the invisibility element is that even the news media doesn't cover us. So newspapers, radio, television, I mean, I've watched COVID coverage for this entire period that we've been under the pandemic, and I've only seen 2 reports. And one of them was about our wonderful brothers and sisters, the Dene out west, or the Navajo. Mm-hmm. And there was a report about how they don't have access to running water. It has to be trucked into them. So that's one tribe out of 574 plus, right? So 574 is the federally recognized tribes. There are more tribes that are state recognized. It's quite a process to be federally recognized. And the invisibility issues occur on websites, on dialogues, on television programs, stereotypical cartoons, football teams that continue to use our names to say that they're honoring us, and as some kind of cartoonish character on their logo. Any number of things where people even wear Halloween costumes that are look like Indians, right? Not recognizing that we are still here, but yet we're not referenced in surveys. How many people have seen a document that shows, yes, this many white Americans have COVID, this many Black Americans, this many Latinx Americans, and you never see Natives on the chart, ever. So I can't tell you how many websites I've gone to just looking to see where we're represented. One of the places I went was about economics, and it compared Native peoples in the U.S. to recent foreign immigrants. A government chart, and we were compared to immigrants, right? It just boggles my mind that we are continually used in that way. And yeah, and I'm sorry, you can probably hear my anger, but
well, rightfully so.
It's frustrating.
And I'm so happy that we actually, with the series, decided that you were available, and we decided to focus on First Nations, because it should not be this way. And so hopefully this is one act toward beginning to correct that. So just in the spirit of transparency, and I hope this, I'm trying to ask questions that are wise, but I'm also curious and I want to know. So you mentioned that people who are like you, if I were to look at you, would I know that you were part Native Malawi? No, so what is it? Let me get it right. Mi'kmaq.
Mi'kmaq.
Right. And of the Abenaki nations, right?
Right.
So then, since it's not visible, you can look at me and say, well, that woman has some African blood in her, for sure. But I can't look at you and say that. So how do people in First Nations, how do you deal with the identity? So for example, at our graduate school, we have students who have some Native heritage, and that makes them eligible for certain fellowships. But if that weren't the case, I don't know if we would know unless they chose to tell us. So how can you help those of us who may not have the ability to recognize, help our Native brothers and sisters feel very comfortable in whatever they decide to do in terms of sharing their culture?
Well, so there's a lot of things to that. So number one, there's the, please let's just stop with the whole concept of people have to look a certain way.
Yes.
There's no one anywhere, it's very, very rare to find somebody that's 100% anything. And on some level, our history of focusing on, quote, race.
Yes.
Is a biological construct that doesn't exist, right? I mean, there's certainly melanin, there's certainly culture, there certainly is immigration patterns, there's certainly, all of the details of our lives and what we've all had to endure in a variety of places. Let's just all create safe spaces so that everybody can be fully who they are, right? So I shouldn't have to have black hair and darker skin to be identified as Native, right? I should be in a safe space where I can be fully who I am and share my spiritual traditions, my livelihood, my food, any number of things. So, certainly some of that is not part of the dominant culture, right? We highlight, we honor, we give privilege to white people. And so, the rest of us who have cultures that are not represented in that white culture, go through a fair number of, shall I say, jumping through hoops and having to, negotiate our way and managing our behavior and our personalities so that we can manage within this dominant white culture. So I'm blessed to right now through nonprofit enterprise at work where I work part-time. I'm blessed to be in a culture there that is very multicultural. Mm-hmm. It's the first workplace that I actually was able to acknowledge that I'm Native in. I can't tell you what that's been like for my whole life, to go through workplaces where jokes are talked about Native people, or people will say things like, well, I'm the low man on the totem pole, so I don't know anything. They don't even know that totem poles are vast resources, spiritual and family heritage. And to say that you're the lowest person on the totem pole doesn't even make sense to tribal people. It's not even consistent with what a totem pole is. Or they'll say something like, well, let's get together and have a powwow. Seriously? What, you're wanting to dance and be in fellowship with each other and, have good food and sing songs and pray? And I don't think that's what you meant. I think you meant you wanted to have a meeting. So there's all these phrases that are offensive to us, let alone sports teams that go by stupid names or offensive names, right?
So what you're saying is, in some ways, the invisibility or the ability to not have your heritage easily recognize is more of a burden than if you think of in terms of Black Americans. I mean, what was it? If you have 1 ounce of Black blood, you're Black, right? And there's the brown bag test and all kinds of other tests to say, can you pass this in order to be light enough or dark enough or whatever. But for our First Nation brothers and sisters, that's not even the option. I mean, it's like I'm trying to understand or think about how in this new normal world that we want to change to, where people are appreciated for all that they are, and that includes their heritage completely, and they feel safe to say when they want to that I'm part Native, or I'm fully Native, or I'm an ounce Native, or whatever it is, or I'm an ounce Latinx, or whatever it is. How do we help each other do that, I guess, is the question. And so maybe we should explore some of those myths that you put up in that slide that we did not talk about. Let's make it a little bit lighter for a moment.
Well, I want to at least address the idea of, sort of a lot of offensive kind of issues come up around that sort of 1 drop rule, right? So certainly Black Americans have had to deal with that. The government of the United States imposed on Native people what's called the blood quantum measurement. So it determines who receives benefits. So 4/4 obviously means full blood. Your mom and dad were full blood, that's who you are. And then with each succeeding generation, if families like mine intermarry with Europeans and whatever, then that blood quantum drops. It's immensely offensive to ask someone, how much Indian are you?
Yes.
Right? Because it's my spiritual culture, it's my family culture, it's my food, it's the group of people that I hang out with, it's what I do, for my leisure time, it's, any number of things. So, to say, well, what % Indian are you is immensely offensive, but it's based on that whole 1 drop rule that Black people from being incorporated into full society roles. And it's what kept our Native people at arm's length from all the white people, putting us on reservations and determining who got food and who didn't.
So how do we make the space safe, in your thoughts, to talk about this?
Well, so a lot of it is just about accepting whole peoples. Like accepting people for however they show up. So creating safe space, creating psychological safety, creating physical safety, certainly any workplace where there are microaggressions going on. So for those that might not know, microaggressions are common behaviors that make someone understand that they are in some way less than, or that there is some element of who they are that is not acceptable in that situation. So whatever we can do to get rid of the boundaries, the barriers, the lack of acceptance, the denial of the whole person. So it starts with our children, it starts with cultural values, it starts with language. So certainly a big piece of, Native people is our language, and unfortunately we're losing it to a great extent. I'm blessed to be in a family. So the topic of our session obviously being medicine, my family are medicine people or ceremonial people. So we refer to medicine differently than the dominant Western culture does. We use herbs and remedies and specific ceremonies to help heal us from different things, both psychological and physical. We welcome our people back from military training or war environments with ceremonies to help them heal from what they've seen and had to endure. So medicine for us is a far broader part of our life way, both from what we eat, what we gather, what we make into tea, the ceremonies and the prayer that we do. Our medicine is broadly part of that. Our language is part of that. So in our ceremonies, we only speak our native language in our prayers. And so anyway, what we can do is to accept all of us, right? No matter what our skin tone, our hair color, our eye color, our height, our weight, if we have a disability, if we speak in a different language, if, you know, anything, just acceptance, right? I mean, on some level, the golden rule is love one another.
That's right. Yes, so getting away from that idea that is so rooted in America of white supremacy, or what our previous speaker called deliberate systems of injustice, and realizing that all people are human beings created by God and have an innate right to be alive and to be valued, and we're all equal and necessary. So there are lots and lots of questions, Judy. I'm like, wow. So first I want to go back to the myths questions. No such thing as a princess. Not everyone who is Native is a chief. What are the terms that should be used or words not to use? Can you just share a little bit about that? And I'm going to look at some of these questions in the chat and see which ones to start. Continue our conversation.
Yeah, I know there's a lot to cover, right? So the whole aspect of there is no Indian princess. So in our powwows, we do have men and women who are chosen as sort of the lead dancers. And, you know, they're people with great respect. They're people that have absolutely beautiful regalia. And by the way, don't call it a costume. It's regalia.
Not a costume.
Not a costume.
What's the word?
Regalia.
Okay.
Regalia.
Gotcha.
So the woman that is selected in that way is often referred to as a princess. But in the way that most people say, oh, my great-great-grandmother was an Indian princess, that doesn't exist. So what some people have said that they think it derived from was when the Europeans came to the United States, they were dominantly from monarchies.
Yes.
And when they met with elders, the leaders of our tribal groups, which more often than not were men, although there are some matrilineal societies and nations in the US, but they dominantly met, you know, the people that we designated, that we voted on to become chiefs. So in most Native cultures, not all, but in most, it's not a handed down father to son role. It's voted on. It's a democratic process. In fact, the democratic process of the United States originates from the Iroquois Nation. And so anyway, so the early Europeans coming from monarchies met these chiefs and thought, well, they're special families, so therefore their daughters must be princesses. So that's one belief for where the phrase Indian princess came from. And it's derogatory in our culture because people are selected for leadership roles in our cultures based upon their ethicality, their honesty, their, you know, being true to their word, acting in a really high level way. And it's not a given, you know, anybody that steps out of line is voted out. So it's not like it's a family of regal people and then there's eventually this person called a princess or even chief. You know, to refer to a Native American as, hey, chief, you know, blah, blah, derogatory, very derogatory. That's an earned higher respect label. And, you know, to refer to a Native person as a chief or a warrior is insulting. And to that point, then there's the term redskin, which I hate. So the European cultures brought to the Native allies that they were with, so the English and the French fighting for the territory and all of that, had their Native allies. And part of what developed that the Europeans taught the natives to do was to take scalps, so big hunks of their hair and their skin from their head.
Wait a minute. you said the Europeans taught the natives to do this.
Yes, so that the natives could get paid for killing others. The native people killed, you know, in many tribal groups, it wasn't a goal to kill other tribal people. It was a goal. So in our Lakota language, it's called counting coup, C-O-U-P, which is to get close enough to someone to touch them with a whip or some kind of riding stick or other a staff or whatever that you have in your hand. To get that close and not kill them shows immense amount of bravery and restraint. So, you know, to kill someone, to take a scalp, was a way of paying people for killing the opposing side. So the Europeans taught their native allies to do that. And the Europeans also did that when they killed native people. They would bring back scalps. And that's how people got paid.
Wow.
Immensely offensive.
I mean, I'm like, okay. Whew. Because
yeah.
I just, so whether it's from movies or I'm remembering my American history that I was taught in school, the lies my teachers taught me. And I'm just thinking, this is so contrary to what most of America has learned.
Right.
That we need to all go back and have more of these conversations to learn the truth. I did hear you say that the democracy that the U.S. is based on came from the way the Iroquois Nation wrote its laws or managed its nation. I'd read that someplace before. And so it's so many myths out there, so many things that are not right. I'm going to segue into a couple of the questions because I want I could talk to you just myself all evening. But so one of the questions, which I think is a fundamental one, is there a national organization for First Nations peoples across, you know, the different nations? And how do we, when we talk about numbers, what do you think are the numbers of the people who would self-identify as First Nation, whether it's on a census or whether it's because they want to identify their culture? Obviously, people don't have to do that, right?
Right. So I haven't seen the 2020 census data. So I believe I remember from the 2010 census that there were 6 million. And mostly we're scattered around. So the states that are the largest for Native populations are California, Arizona, New Mexico, Michigan, North and South Dakota, New York, Florida. So some in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Alaska's
yes.
Tremendous amount of the 574 distinct groups. A tremendous number are from Alaska, just because of the sheer size of the land and the isolated nature of the tribal peoples there. Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, there's a lot. You know, Michigan has, gosh, I want to say 6 reservations / reserves / tribal groups. So the Three Fires Confederacy is the dominant group here in Michigan, and that represents the Odawa, Potawatomi, and the Ojibwa. And there were earlier peoples here, including my Lakota people. A lot of my Native friends in the state tease me a lot about they kicked my ass. So, you know, and some of us intermarried, but then, you know, we don't respect, you know, sort of country borders. So I have an auntie that's Mohawk from Canada. And, you know, so there's Cree people in the UP and yeah. So anyway.
Is there a possibility then that the fragmentation of the First Nations people that was purposefully designed to reduce their influence and power and just ability to survive could now be reversed to come together as how much development of political power and influence is going on at the moment. I mean, we clearly saw from even the little bit you showed us the things that have resulted in generational trauma and systematic oppression. But so what's happening now from people?
A lot is happening now. So anyone that maybe might have heard about on the news, the Dakota Access Pipeline is trying to come down through North Dakota. So thankfully, allies, friends from across the world came together with our Lakota peoples and tribal groups from all over the continent that came together to get that stopped. Tribal peoples here in Michigan have been working hard on getting Line 5 stopped that goes through the Straits of Mackinac. There's a lot of political will and a lot of political action going on all the time. There is a lot of activity in various states for reclaiming and working with government officials to reclaim our fishing rights, our hunting rights, our gathering rights. So there's still herbs and foods out there that are classically part of what we call medicine, and getting access to the lands where we can harvest it in the right season and time. So there's lots of political activity around, certainly lawsuits for the rights of not only tribal peoples, but to reverse the negative effects of what the treaties that were denied caused. There is an action undertaking right now with a movement to Congress to remove the medals of honor that were given to the Army soldiers that massacred our families at Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, all the different massacres. Many of those soldiers were given medals of honor for using cannon on women and children. Cannon. It's mind-boggling, right? So anyway, so there is a lot of political activity. Thankfully, the rising knowledge of people in the broader community about the issues of the Indigenous peoples are bringing lots of friends and what some people would call allies to come and help us. The key element is that please continue to let the Indigenous people have the main voice. Do not, listen, like the Indigenous people should be the leaders. The Indigenous people should decide strategy. The Indigenous people should select when and how and what is done. So that's
I hear you.
Elements.
I think tonight there are a lot of allies that are going to become, not only start to become informed, but continue to be so. There's so many questions. So I want to ask you about something you mentioned with the medicine, and when the soldiers come back from their service and they're welcome home to help them deal with what they've seen. But what I understand is with the medicines now, with the reservations where many First Nations people are living, there may not be access to the things that, or even culturally extending or sharing that knowledge from generation to generation to know what to do. I mean, I was looking, as I mentioned to you in our conversation, at a calendar from 2014, and there's a page here with a picture on children, just masses of them of all ages who were, it says Native American children taken from their parents and forced to attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where they were taught to reject and abandon Native values, traditions, beliefs, and practices. And it goes on to say in 1928, the Interior Department condemned the conditions of Native American boarding schools, citing insufficient food, overcrowded dorms, substantial Medicare, and exploitative child labor practices. By the 1930s, most off-reservation boarding schools were closed. And so as I read a little bit more, the purpose of those schools was to take everything, was to assimilate these
Right.
these children.
Right.
So how do you recapture a systematic program to take away who you are and everything you use?
So thankfully, our people are resilient, and thankfully, our people are very clever, and we have vast places that we know better than anybody else, right? So my own family, because we're a ceremonial family, hid out.
So let's back up for a minute. Your family, a ceremonial family. Just unpack that before you go on. I don't want people to run past that.
So our family has been handed down through generations a variety of special ceremonies or spiritual traditions, if you will, that help our family with healing, prayer, acknowledging our spiritual connection, right? So as a ceremonial family, there was a very concerted effort to not have any of the children negatively influenced by the white culture. So the family escaped to the hills, and, you know, a number of places there are caves and places to hide. And so they successfully did that. Lots of people did that, Native people. And, or they pretended that they, you know, they would learn enough English to get by, but quietly, privately, in their own places, kept the language going in the family. And, you know, taught the kids how to deal with that. And, you know, not that there wasn't damage, there was immense damage. And with every elder that dies, we lose an entire library, of course. But the language is being regenerated in schools. There are language lessons for adults. There are online courses. There are dictionaries. There are oral traditions. There's any number of active community engagement, taking people out on the land and teaching them what the herbs look like, when to harvest them, how to prepare them. So there's an active, I wouldn't even say revitalization so much as just a revealing, because
Yes.
it always existed. It's just now it's safer to talk about. Up until 1973, practicing our spiritual tradition was illegal.
Illegal according to the Interior
United States government.
Wow.
We could be arrested for holding our own ceremonies.
Wow. I'm
Yeah.
going to ask some of the questions that I see here. I stopped
Sure.
you from going someplace when I asked you about unpacking your family's generational role. I don't even remember where we were going, but at any rate.
Ceremonial stuff, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Paula asked, is the wealth and independent infrastructure of the Dene peoples a solution or a model to the offenses that have happened? Would you say that what they're doing, and you might explain what is happening with the Dene people I think this is in South.
Can you read that all again?
Is the wealth and independent infrastructure of the Dene peoples a solution, a model to the offenses that were documented in your slide presentation? Is it, in other words, the Dene people, what is the more familiar to most of us?
Navajo.
The Navajo Nation, in terms of some autonomy and independent infrastructure. I know one of the students in my class was talking about the Navajo Nation taking control of their medical care, as opposed to having it served by people who come to pay back their student loans by serving for a short amount of time or some amount of time at the reservation, right, and not giving very good medical care. So they right. moved to sending chosen ones to be trained in Western medicine as well as their own tribal medicine conditions. Right. So is this a model, I think is what the question means.
Well, so yes and no. So there's a couple of unique aspects of a culture that you have to address. So number one, they're the only people that were forced off their lands and then allowed by the government to actually come back. So long story to all of that we don't have time for, but when they came back, then there was a concerted effort, thankfully by some very wise people among the tribe, to not only did they get back a portion of their original lands, but they built on it. So, and built on it, I don't mean building structures. I mean, they built on growing it, you know, getting in more lands and buying up stuff and all of that. So to the point that native reservations are by and large placed in areas that were thought to be non-productive and, you know, whatever. Well, you know, luckily for the Navajo or Dene, they were able to scarf up, buy up, gather together so that they have millions of acres. They're the largest land base in the entire North America. And so from that, then there's tourism, you know, everybody comes to see the beautiful territory and, you know, paying fees to come in there, and then restaurants and hotels and a variety of things. And yes, casinos in a variety of native populations. There are casinos that benefit the tribal people. So there are a variety of different models that work and then don't work. So there's certainly on the spiritual side, a fair number of people that oppose the casinos because of the abuse and the nasty, you know, sort of ways that gets people to abusing their own money.
Sure.
But it does bring in money to tribes, and then the tribes disperse it or utilize it for medical care, education, housing, et cetera, et cetera. So, so they've done, you know, an awesome job with managing it. There are tribal governments that have, just like in the white dominant culture, politicians that abuse their power. So that happens also in tribal government. And so, but yeah, there's models.
So that's one model you're saying that has worked, but that may not be possible for many others because of the land, that
Correct.
unique situation
Correct.
of the Dene. When
Correct.
you talk about these treaty violations, you said every one of the U.S. treaties, and even if it weren't every one, but the treaties have been just not honored, broken.
No.
And so one of the questions I had written for you is that this to me is an example of American capitalism at whatever cost, no matter what it is, the brainwashing of the notion of the white supremacy or the deliberate systems of injustice, that we should be able to have whatever we can manage to grab, regardless of who that means we misuse, oppress, abuse, steal from, or whatever we do. And of course, many people today weren't responsible for those things. But the white supremacy, that the idea that the privilege is still there. And can you just comment on how you deal with it? how First Nations people cope?
Well, so there's lawsuits. There's ongoing.
Okay, that's a good one.
Yep, lawsuits, right? We're going to use your own law against you. You know, we're going to come at you. So yeah, there's lawsuits going on. There's certainly a level of, you know, there's some things that sort of we've adapted to and figured out ways to deal with. There are, you know, certainly the aspect of, thankfully, what's arising now with people becoming more enlightened and saying, let's fix this, let's do something about it, right? So our Lakota Nation, for instance, won a huge court case, billions of dollars, for the Black Hills. Well, we don't want the money, we want the Black Hills. They're sacred to us. It's about having our sacred space. It's not about the dollars. So there's a variety of places around, you know, North America where people are reclaiming fishing rights and hunting rights and land rights and, you know, sort of fighting back. So there are some things that are very positively happening in that way. Not that it's easy by any means, but that whole concept is becoming very much more aware to the dominant culture and the fact that we're not going to shut up. We're going to keep going.
That was a question from Katrina, which you just answered, and I'll just repeat the question. Can you speak on one or two of the treaties that the government didn't honor, and is anything being done today to address this, or can anything be done? And I think that's what you just said. Use the laws themselves against, and some of the laws which probably originated anyway from the First Nations in terms of doing right about people to one another. I want to look at two other questions, and then we're going to turn to the hope side. What is it that we want to collectively and individually come away from this with, in the idea that we are in a season of change? We're in a place where I believe the nation's, actually the whole world's attention has been secured through the COVID pandemic, and it allowed us to sit still and be home or be away from one another in our usual routine long enough to really look at what we're doing and who we are and how we're treating one another and how we're treating the earth. And so I want to ultimately get to your what makes you hopeful from this time of change, that we collectively and individually can begin to bring about change. Let me see if there's one more question in here. Someone says, what can we do to help? Absolutely, that's where we want to go. Infectious diseases and other diseases that over historic times and still now affect the health and well-being of First Nation people. So I'm thinking of diabetes, and I'm thinking of tuberculosis, and obviously COVID, and all kinds of respiratory diseases. How do you, is it because of being confined to reservations and the historical things with, you mentioned the food, the government food that was not the best, or not the vegetables and things that people were genetically used to having? How do we begin to recognize those things and counter them? That's those health disparities that we see in the African community, African American community. What do you say to people who say, well, you know, Native people just aren't taking good care of themselves?
Well, to that, I would say, number one, our tribal peoples are creating really great programs that center the dietary nutritional needs of our people back to original sources. So, you know, the foods that our people lived off of, living off the land, fresh, non-manufactured, not genetically modified, without hormones, et cetera, and tying, you know, healthcare. So there's a wonderful program here in Michigan that the Southeast Michigan Indians community does, that ties diabetes management and self-care to our spiritual traditions. And, you know, so the linkage of the two is not about just some white doctor saying, well, stop eating sugar. You know, they've been acculturated into sugar because the dominant culture for sugar and everything, right? So teaching people the spiritual value of taking care of this temple that is our bodies, and then also getting to foods that are healthy, that are based on what our people used to eat generations ago, and how to do that. So having our own home gardens, having our own places where we go and collect herbs and roots and make our own teas and all of that sort of thing. Actively doing that kind of work to help people reintegrate with what are, in a sense, our DNA took care of us on in the past. We're going to those older models, you know, getting exercise. You know, our people walked a lot. And so getting people that have diabetes in their family, as mine has. So getting people walking, getting people eating more of the healthy foods, getting people to eat the foods indigenous to our cultures, getting people to learn about how to prepare. So there's some dietary things. We call them the three sisters, pumpkin, squash, and corn. And helping people understand how to grow those, because they all three of them grow well together and adapt to each other. They each add different chemicals to the soil and shade each other and all of that. So giving people indigenous recipes, there are indigenous chefs out there that are bringing forward modern versions of some of these very old recipes, and helping people to understand how that can help them, their bodies return to a better physical state. Playing into our spiritual values too.
They're tied together so well. And the last question we'll take, and then we'll close out, is from Suzanne, who says, I believe education is extremely important. The detailed truth about the first Native people and African American people is so distorted and minimal. How can we increase what children learn?
So certainly from the standpoint of education, as much as possible, all of us encourage school systems to get broadly diverse books that representing reasonable representations, like by Native authors, by Black authors, by Asian authors. Get books written by and for them so that our children see themselves in a really heroic story and begin to accept and value their cultures. For kids like me who grew up in a mixed racial family, but, being able to have aunties and uncles around that acknowledged all of the different parts of who I am and giving me the lessons and the stories of that. So doing that at a young age for our children, seeking that out for ourselves. There are 3 indigenous organizations here in Southeast Michigan, Southeast Michigan Indians Incorporated in Centerline. There is the National Association of American Indians in Detroit. And there is the American Indian Health Center down, I don't know, technically I think it's Detroit, it's on Lawndale. There are a couple of organizations locally here in Southeast Michigan that offer classes. There's plenty of online content. Facebook is full. Pinterest is full. There's a lot of recipes. There are people that do webinars. So, if it's not part of your culture, then of course, respect the culture. It's not like, if you're not a Catholic priest, why would you even think about doing a mass, right? So, stay away from our sacred stuff, of course, because it's not who you are. But, certainly if you want to learn about and cultivate native foods, there's native foods from Michigan. Fiddlehead ferns are marvelous to eat. And, the Morel Festival that we just went to last weekend. And, there's all sorts of wonderful local foods that, learn about their medicinal values. Flat cedar tea sustained me through the pandemic.
Flat cedar?
Flat cedar tea.
Okay. We're going to have to talk more about that. I think I've just made a new friend, someone who I'm excited about this journey with. I do believe, as we started out this event tonight with the tribute to George Floyd and his life and his death and the change that this represents, the idea that we're at a pivotal point in the USA, in the world, where people will decide whether they're going to stand up and be human beings.
Correct.
And be advocates for everybody else being human, or if they're going to just go along to get along. So I think as we get to the end of the time here, and there's so much more that we'll just have to talk more and continue this at another session. But I want to just say that because of what we're seeing now with the all ages and the multi-ethnic and multiracial groups that were in the streets and that came to be from the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd and other atrocities, that this is not just a temporary thing. The company's response, and I, for one, am going to be holding people responsible and accountable for what they've said they're going to do, and to learn better. You know, you can't do better if you don't know better. And those of us who are part of it have to be willing to share and to have those difficult conversations that help all of us learn and grow. So I just want, are you hopeful, Judy, about where we are?
I am. You know, seeing the multicultural, multiracial groups in the Black Lives Matter movements, all of the different protests that happened around the Dakota Access Pipeline and the M5 line, there are people coming together to serve the common good. And I am very hopeful. And I was born an optimist, but I'm even more so with how I've seen neighbors helping neighbors and people reaching out in ways to try and get on board, you know, with some of these issues.
Well, I'm an optimist too, but I also have to recognize and manage. The more I learn about what has happened in the history of people, my people, your people, other people, and how the idea of deliberate systems of injustice have influenced this whole country to keep us all from being the best of who we are. I'm having to figure out how to channel my anger and about this into positive ways, and being part of Race in Medicine is one of those. So I'm really, really grateful that you have come to this series, and I hope you'll come back, and I hope we'll be able to get together somewhere between Milford and Dexter and share that tea very soon. I'm hoping to our audience that you've gotten something insightful from tonight. I know there's so many other questions that we could be here for hours to help unpack, but I just want to thank you as our audience for Race in Medicine for coming. The third part of this series will be probably at the end of the month of June, and we'll focus really on the disparities in COVID that have been talked about, but now you have some of the background on why. And so hopefully this will motivate and empower all of us to realize that we're in this together. As we come out of this pandemic, the work is just beginning to become a human society where all people can function to their greatest potential. And this idea of deliberate systems of injustice will be no longer allowed to survive. So Judy, I'm going to ask that you close us out in a prayer. This is WISDOM, after all, is an interdenominational group of women from all kinds of faiths, all believing that there is a higher power. And as an ordained minister, I also believe that, but I know people pray in different ways. So I'm going to ask you to close us out tonight. And first of all, thank you so much for sharing tonight, pouring out your heart, preparing and talking with us and helping to inform us. So would you close us out, and then we'll go to Dolores to do the farewell. Just remembering that the third part of this will be the last Tuesday in June is our current date. Thank you so much, Judy Muhn, for your expertise, your sensibilities, and your willingness to share.
Thank you, Oveta. As we all join in prayer, Tunkashala, Peitopa Makaino Wakantaka. We are your daughters, your sons, your grandchildren, Tunkashala. We are grateful for this time together. We are grateful for the unity that we have in these moments. We are grateful that all of us have come together, using our eyes and our ears to hear and see all of the things that we can do, what is ours to do into the future. And we join together as brothers and sisters in the chain of life with those that are walking, swimming, flying, crawling on the earth, as well as growing grass and trees, the flowers and the beauty that we live in and around. We have beauty before us, beauty behind us, beauty on either sides of us, beauty above us and below us.
Yes.
We respect our mother, the earth, and we respect the sky and the nations of the sky. Thank you for this time. Thank you for the blessing of life. And thank you for all of those who give their lives so that we might live. Mitakuyesu.
I tell you, Judy, how much I appreciate you for saying yes. Dr. Fuller, I appreciate you saying yes because you're bringing this all together. I appreciate everybody else for saying yes,